It is February 13, 2008. My name is Don Linky. We're here on the campus of Rutgers University in New Brunswick at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. This morning we'll be conducting another interview in the series for the Brendan T. Byrne Archive of the Rutgers Program on the Governor. We'll be talking today with Professor of Public Policy Alan Rosenthal. Alan is a former director of the Eagleton Institute and a veteran professor of public policy and government with a national reputation as a leading researcher and analyst of state legislatures and state governments. We'll be discussing how legislatures and governors relate both in formal and informal powers around the country, how New Jersey specifically fits into that national context, how governors deal with legislatures both in terms of their formal powers and their informal authority, and also how particular governors have different styles in how they view their jobs and particularly their relationships with the governors. Alan, you've been studying state legislatures for many years and writing about them. How does New Jersey fit in terms of the national context? How are we similar? How are we different in terms of the structure of our state legislatures, in terms of formal authority, and in particular their relation to the governors?
Well, one could compare states now, but if you go back, when I started studying legislatures in the 1960s and 1966, New Jersey constitutionally, had a strong governor compared to most states. Politically, New Jersey's governor was strong. I think constitutionally, the governor was the single elected state official. That made him strong. The legislature was constitutionally weak, with members running every 2 years or every 4 years. The governor was further strengthened by the political situation in New Jersey and the strength of local political leaders, county leaders. And the county leaders, who basically chose their legislator delegations, worked through the governor. Basically, the county leaders were willing to provide New Jersey governors with votes in return for appointments. The governor would appoint the candidates nominated by the county leaders, chosen by the county leaders. So on major items, the governor usually would have the votes in the legislature. There were strong Republican counties and strong Democratic counties. And governors pretty well could get their way. Moreover, in the 1960s, the legislature was extraordinarily part-time. It was woefully staffed. Now, it wasn't very different than other legislatures. There were a couple of legislatures that were much more capable, such as the California legislature, which began to develop capacity in the 1950s, the late 1950s, and the New York legislature that was staffed. But most state legislatures were basically undeveloped institutions, New Jersey among them. New Jersey had a more powerful governor constitutionally and politically than most other states. The interesting thing, too, about the legislature and the governor, one of the major, issues that a governor and a legislature handle at each session, it's the only issue that has to be handled, is the budget. Well, the governor and the governor's staff formulated the budget. And the legislature had no budget or expertise to review the budget. And it was the governor's budget director who would generally go over and advise the legislature after the governor's budget director had formulated the budget for the governor. I mean, obviously there was no separation of powers as far as staff expertise was concerned. So the legislature had to draw on the executive branch official. Well, I mean, you can see that the legislature in the early 1960s was certainly not an equal branch of government. That did not differentiate the New Jersey legislature from many other legislatures in the nation.
You've written about the distinction between the formal and informal powers of the governor, and particularly in relation to gubernatorial legislative relations. Why don't you, first of all, sort of describe that distinction in more detail, and then more specifically discuss the formal powers in New Jersey that give the governor some leverage in dealings with the legislature?
Well, as I mentioned, I think the informal power of the governor is basically political power, which is relatively constant. It changes over the years in a state, but relatively constant. And the New Jersey governor had political power because the New Jersey governor dealt with the political leaders locally, and the political leaders chose the legislators who would be in that delegation. So the governor, I mean, that is clear political power. The governor also has power, but this is constitutional or statutory, to make appointments. And that is power because with the power to make appointments, the governor can deal with legislators. There are trades with legislators. The governor also has the power to veto, the power to line item veto, the power to conditionally veto, all of which can be used as threats to legislators. Unless a legislator goes along with the governor on a governor's major piece of legislation, well, the governor may veto that legislator's pet bill that the legislator needs for his or her district. I think the greatest political power of the governor, and it's true of any governor, and it's organizationally, it's, you know, constitutionally in a sense, is that the governor is one. And the legislature is many. The legislature is two houses, except in Nebraska where it's one. The legislature is two parties in each house. And the legislature is as many members as exist in the House and the Senate. In New Jersey, you've got 40 senators and 80 assemblymen. And the effort for the legislature is to come together, to reach a consensus, to get to a position. And when it gets to a position, it can, you know, pass legislation or defeat legislation. The governor has no such problem in arriving at a position. The governor, you know, consults with his or her advisors, cabinet members, department heads, and there may be an open consultation, but once the governor decides I'm going with X or I'm going with Y, that is the decision. That decision is not challenged. The governor does not have a real difficult time arriving at decision. There's study, deliberation that goes in, but the legislature has a difficult political time arriving at decision, getting the votes. So that advantage, which is, you know, not unique to any single state, is always with the governor. And with that advantage of oneness as opposed to manyness is the advantage of the governor having, and this is informal, the bully pulpit. The governor being one, the governor is the object of media attention. The governor can get media attention. No one in the legislature, unless the person is indicted or convicted, can get equal media attention. And that's really not a way legislators want to get media attention, by indictment or conviction. So, you know, the governor can stage, you know, things. He can look for media opportunities. The governor can strategize and conduct a media campaign. The legislature can't. I mean, the Senate president and the Speaker of the Assembly can get some attention, but they don't speak for the entire legislature. They don't even speak for their chamber. They may speak for their majority party in that chamber. The governor, though, speaks for the state, for the executive branch. So that is an enormous advantage that the governor has. The governor also, either constitutionally or statutorily, state by state, formulates the budget. The governor puts it together. Doesn't mean that the governor determines, everything that's in it, and much of the budget is, the same year to year. It's sort of built in, but there's a discretionary part, and that really is what governors in most states, not all states, do. They kind of put the budget together within the executive branch. It goes over to the legislature, and the legislature can make changes up or down or around, but the legislature pretty much operates off the governor's document. So I think this is another advantage that New Jersey and other governors have over their legislatures. Today, I would say, the New Jersey governor is one of the more powerful governors because he or she is the only statewide elected official, and because he or she also, like other governors, has the bully pulpit and the advantage of being one and getting media attention. Because the governor in New Jersey has many appointments that that make legislators deal with the governor, because the governor has a strong veto power. Yeah, the New Jersey governor is powerful, but as powerful as maybe a couple of other governors in the United States. Maybe a half dozen governors have, comparable power to the New Jersey governors. Not constitutionally entirely, constitutionally, statutorily, or politically.
What are the other states that you think compare with New Jersey in terms of the strong governor?
Well, Maryland has a strong governor. One reason is that the governor's budget power is greater in Maryland than probably anywhere else in the nation. And that is because statutorily, the Maryland legislature can only cut the budget that is presented by the governor. It cannot move around items, and it cannot raise items. It cannot raise the total, the bottom line. It cannot raise lines that come above the bottom line. It can only cut, and this is because in the early 20th century, people were annoyed at legislatures. They seemed to be corrupt or profligate, and they cut back on the power of the legislature to kind of keep throwing money away. They thought the executive would be a more rational actor in a budget process. So the legislature has never been able to, or had the guts in Maryland to try to constitutionally take back that power that was ceded to the governor. So that is, the legislature, therefore, in Maryland has got to go to the governor sort of begging to get something that it wants in a supplemental. So the governor really has that great advantage in Maryland.
I believe you've also pointed out that Maryland has a somewhat unique system giving the governor leverage over the periodic redistricting of the legislature after each decennial census.
Yes, I mean that is a very strange power that is accorded to the governor in Maryland. It's only good every 10 years, but it's pretty good, for a couple of years leading up to the redistricting. And that is, the governor submits a plan to the legislature, a redistricting plan for House seats and Senate seats in the state. And if the legislature cannot get together and substitute its own plan, the governor's plan gets through. And very rarely, if never, I think, has the legislature been able to substitute its own plan for the governor's plan. So, I mean, the governor then redistricts each seat, each district in the House or in the Assembly. And, kind of leading up to that, members don't want to mess with the governor. They don't want their districts changed, or, more Republicans being added to a Democratic district or more Democrats to a Republican district. And that gives the governor significant leverage. And the governor uses that leverage.
I believe you've also pointed out some anecdotes of Maryland governors having the redistricting map sitting over their shoulder when they meet with legislators.
Yeah, I mean,
to sort of silently give the message.
Paris Glendening enjoyed it enormously. He, in his office where he met with legislators, he had two easels. On one easel was a map of House districts. On the other easel was a map of the Senate districts. When he had a appointment with a member of the House, The member of the House would come into his office, and Glendenning would be staring at the redistricting map of the House. And contrarily, when he had a meeting with the senator, Glendenning would be looking at the Senate map. And the legislators got the idea that he was looking at how to draw their districts, and Glendenning would joke about it. It was no joke to legislators. That put the fear of, not God, but the fear of the governor into their minds. And during those years leading right up to redistricting, Glendenning was extraordinarily successful, but might have been successful anyway with the legislature.
In addition to Maryland, what are the few other states that you think have strong gubernatorial powers?
Well, I think California has, had strong governors and strong legislatures until term limits. I think Pennsylvania has had strong governor. I think that the governor in Illinois has been strong. Mainly the strength is derived, from the general strength of governors being one, but also from political strength that governors have been able to amass.
Are there any other special formal powers, like you pointed out in Maryland, in other states that are somewhat unique in terms of the governor's leverage?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge.
So in those other states, it's more a combination
it would be more
of political
appointments
culture
and political and cultural, and partially it would be a kind of a legislature that has gotten into the habit, of kind of rolling over and playing dead when asked to do X, Y, or Z by the governor.
Now you mentioned some of the formal powers in New Jersey that the governor is given by the 1946 Constitution. I assume that most, if not all, states have a veto given to the governor over legislation.
The veto, varies. I mean, all states now have a veto. Governors have a veto power. Up until, about 10 years ago, North Carolina didn't have a veto power for the governor. About 35 states have a line item veto, including New Jersey.
And the line item is deleting specific appropriations in a omnibus appropriation.
And sometimes it is interpreted as deleting language as well as dollar amounts. And that's really, the courts decide case by case as to whether governors have exceeded their line item veto authority. And in New Jersey and probably another 10 or so states, there is a veto that is called conditional or amendatory veto, and that allows the governor to change the language instead of vetoing a bill and sending it back to the legislature with the governor's language. The legislature then either passes what the governor wants, or it has to, risk a veto and try to override the veto. And the thing about vetoes is that you've got to override it with extraordinary majorities. It varies, by states, anywhere from 60% to 2/3 majorities are needed. So this is very difficult, particularly if it's a two-party legislature and the governor's party, can prevent that kind of veto override from occurring.
Now you mentioned the appointment power of the governor. In New Jersey, the governor is the sole appointing authority of executive departments, his cabinet, and also appoints all judges and prosecutors in the state. How does that compare with other states?
I think the governor is as strong as any other governor in terms of appointing power. First of all, the governor is the single state official elected statewide, not counting the United States senators. That isn't true in most other states. It's true in a couple of other states. And this means that the governor doesn't have to worry about any other cabinet member, kind of crossing him or her. It gives the governor complete control over state government. There's no superintendent of public instruction who, kind of has education. There's no attorney general who is independent of the governor. And this, I think, is considerable power. Now we're going to have a lieutenant governor, but the lieutenant governor is going to run on the same ticket and, presumably be picked by the governor to run on that ticket. in addition to, having control of his or her own administration, which is important, even more important in terms of dealing with the legislature is having control of a lot of boards and commissions and appointments of judges and attorneys, county attorneys, and what have you. And these are the kinds of appointments that legislators want to get for their constituents. They want to, represent their constituents and want to get for, qualified constituents appointments to boards or commissions or to jobs. And they have to go to the governor. And they have to ask the governor to make the appointment or make the nomination. And that means the governor has this bargaining power. I mean, it doesn't have to be explicit, but, if you're on the wrong side of the governor, if you're always voting against the governor's program, you can't really expect the governor to, favor your guy over somebody else's guy or girl. I mean, there are a lot of qualified people out there, and there's no reason why the governor has got to go with you. So that is something that really does work with legislators, and particularly I think it works in New Jersey.
And of course there's an important political component to that trade-off of leverage also. If an individual legislator cannot get the person he is favoring for a position on a board or as a prosecutor or a judge, I assume it sort of shows some weakness in terms of his own strength, which translates down to the local level in terms of political support.
Yeah, I think that's quite right. I mean, legislators, want to look efficacious. In politics, it's very important to look like you can get things done. And you can look like that if you can get things done. And if you can't, it doesn't speak well, in your district. It doesn't speak well with people who are active in politics. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be challenged in a primary, but you want to do. That's part of your job is representing your district. Okay, it's a big, and in New Jersey, and this is something that really distinguishes New Jersey's legislature from other states, and I'd like to talk about it if you've got some time. In New Jersey, there really is a local orientation by the legislators. Now, in every state, legislators are what I call rooted in their districts for a variety of reasons. In New Jersey, they're embedded in their districts. So they want to represent constituents, and that means, helping them out, getting them jobs, advancing their interests, reflecting their views in all sorts of ways. So if they can't deliver, whether it's pork for the district, or whether it's the right, school aid formula for the district, or whether it's appointments for people in the district, if they can't deliver, they're just not doing the job that they would want to do.
I want to probe that a little bit more in a few minutes and also talk about how the district definition and geography has changed over the last 50 years or so. But before we do that, in terms of appointments, are there states where the legislature has real appointment authority of executive positions and boards and commissions?
There, in South Carolina, the legislature chooses judges, and that gives the legislature a little clout. To my knowledge, and I'm a little limited on this, there are no states where legislatures really have a lot of appointments. There have been some states where legislatures have had appointments, and in many of those places, the courts have, ruled the appointing authority of the legislature as unconstitutional. I mean, this happened in Rhode Island because it was considered to be a violation of separation of powers. So I think for the most part, legislatures, have, been satisfied with the advise and consent, provisions that they have been given constitutionally in terms of certain gubernatorial appointments. But legislatures, I think in virtually everywhere, legislators have had to go to the governor to get these, kind of low-level appointments through. And it's important to all legislators to be able to do that.
Are there any other sort of...
Now, let me just say that, in many states, and New Jersey included, the number of appointments that the governor controls have been reduced over the last, 50 years because of civil service requirements. 50 years ago, patronage was pretty rampant. Today, it's, much less rampant because of civil service requirements, and there are just fewer appointments. They're still important, but they're fewer.
Some analysts have pointed to the 1946 New Jersey Constitution as trying to centralize executive power under the governor, as we've been discussing, through appointments, the veto power, budget process, and other formal powers. To the extent you can briefly describe the pre-1946 situation in New Jersey and how it's changed.
Well, I think in New Jersey and throughout the nation, the period before the 1930s was a period in which governors, the executive, did not have the kind of power or rational organization that it has today. I think nationally what happened in the 1930s was a kind of a progressive movement, a public administration movement that followed on the heels of progressivism, and a kind of managerial movement to kind of improve management in state government. And that was a managerial movement that, focused on the executive branch. So I think the 46 Constitution in New Jersey was similar to what was going on in other places, at other constitutional conventions, or in, other ways. And that was, how do we, kind of improve and modernize the executive to manage government? I think everything was, kind of looked at in terms of the executive branch making policy, making budgets, and advancing the public interest. I think legislatures were part-time. Legislatures were part of the problem at that time, not part of the solution.
And going even further back in history, I think this was before your time, but...
Nothing was before my time.
Well, at the Revolution, when the colonies were adopting their first constitutions as the new states, many of them saw the legislature or the provincial assemblies or colonial assemblies as really the local sort of representative of popular sentiment of the revolutionaries against the executive, who in England was the crown.
And through the colonial governors.
So that the early state constitutions generally gave the legislature a primary role over the executive, but that changed quickly, didn't it?
Yeah, that changed. I mean, basically, the legislature, if you look at the Madison, Hamilton, Jay, and the Federalist Papers, and if you look at the debates, the legislature was the powerful body. And shaping, the federal government was a question of, how do you hold the legislature in check? And that was the dominant branch. And, the executive, executive power was held in check because of the reaction to the British, royal executive power. But, pretty soon it became apparent to the Founding Fathers that the legislative branch was the branch that had to be balanced. Well, I think, through the 19th century particularly, governors gained in power and legislatures, kind of lost power. So as you came into the 20th century, the governor didn't dominate, but the governor was on the way. And then I think the governor got a boost in this movement to sort of rationalize government and rationalize the executive in the third or fourth decade of the 20th century. It's interesting that there are spurts and periods of what you might call, kind of modernization that take place with regard to political institutions. As I say, the first half of the 20th century was a period in which the executive was being, affected and modernized, and legislatures were kind of sitting there in their very part-time condition. By the 1960s, and particularly after the reapportionment revolution of the mid-late 1960s, it was the legislative branch around the country that was being modernized. And through the late 60s, into the 70s, and probably petering out in the 80s, depending upon the particular state, there was a national movement for legislative reform or legislative modernization. And it was a major movement in which New Jersey, was involved. I mean, New Jersey was, one legislature among national legislatures. And even though New Jersey is a somewhat parochial state, there was an important figure in New Jersey, Ray Bateman, who was in the Assembly and then in the Senate in leadership positions. And Ray was a participant in this national legislative movement, and Ray came into contact with legislative leaders from around the country. And I think that caused, Ray Bateman to kind of bring legislative reform back to New Jersey into the legislature, and it got played out in the 1960s, even before Byrne was elected, and then it kind of continued to run a course in the 1970s. So you did have that period of legislative reform in New Jersey, not exactly the way it played out in California or it played out in Kentucky, but it was going on.
And of course, just for context, Ray Bateman was a state senator, Senate president, and the Republican gubernatorial opponent of Brendan Byrne in 1977.
Well, I'm glad I made the connection to Brendan Byrne here. Yeah.
I wanted to go back again, though, to sort of the initial establishment of the legislature-executive relationship, going back to, I guess, the situation after the Revolution. I've always been struck that in New Jersey that the governor's power after independence was very weak, in the sense the governor was given a one-year term and very limited powers, but that as a practical matter, the governor's performance, and the first governor in New Jersey was William Livingston, an ancestor of Governor Thomas Kean in more contemporary times, was elected 12 straight years since his performance was so effective. And I don't know how that compares in other states, but it seems that the advantages, and you've pointed to some of them already today, the governor is a single person who could make decisions, who could be found quickly, as opposed to the collective body of a legislature, particularly in the early years of the Revolution, when the British were chasing colonial legislatures out of their capitals and arresting them and so forth, had some inherent advantages, even going back to those times at the beginning of the country.
Well, I think the other thing, and I'm not terribly sure of this, so you'd have to really get some historians and New Jersey historians. I think when you go back to the founding of the Republic and the first years after the Constitution was adopted, you had a political class that was an elite class that truly believed in public service and noblesse oblige. I mean, if you look at the framers of the Constitution, these are quite unusual individuals. It was not a democratic society. It was a society in which there were privileged people and very able people. So I think you were getting these people in public office. You weren't getting people that we have today. You know, anybody can run, and politics is democratized. And I think that, led to the kind of leadership that existed, in many states in the executive, or certainly existed in the early years of the Republic. I don't know exactly when that changed, probably around, Jackson and the spoils system and the democratization of the office-holding class. But I think that has something to do with it, plus just the inherent powers of being a governor. It's interesting. People today, for example, have no sense of the legislature, but they do have a sense of a governor. The governor is a person. The governor is flesh and blood. Whether you like John Corzine or hate John Corzine, or whether you gave Brendan Byrne the finger or you gave him the victory sign, the governor was a person, and that got the attention of people. The legislature is an abstraction, being many. It is virtually impossible to understand, and it's very difficult to have much empathy for an abstraction such as the legislature. And I think this is an enormous advantage of governors, and it cuts both ways. You can be loved and you can be hated. And right now, John Corzine, with the very ambitious monetization, restructuring of state debt, is more likely to be hated than loved. But the governor is basically at the helm. The legislature is there adjusting the sails, but the governor is steering. And I think that is an advantage. It's not to say that the legislature in New Jersey today has no power. In New Jersey today, I think the legislature is doing a remarkable job for a variety of reasons. But the legislature is really acting for the first time, to my knowledge, in the history of New Jersey as a co-equal branch of government. This has, I think, a lot to do with the leadership of Joe Roberts in the Assembly and the leadership of Dick Cody in the Senate. But the legislature is coming out with its own proposals. It's not taking what the governor suggests. The legislature is very political, but it's been ambitious. That gets us ahead of where you are back at the Revolution.
Yeah, well, let me push you back into time again. You've written about the different styles of governors in dealing with the legislature. Why don't we discuss that for a bit and give some examples from New Jersey and also some other states in terms of how governors view their job and particularly their relations with legislatures differently?
Well, very easily stated, and I think it does make a difference. There are governors who have respect for legislatures, and there are governors who don't. And I think that is really a very important point. Governors who have respect for legislatures understand that what legislators need, what legislators want, how to deal with legislators, how to comfort them, solace them, stroke them. Governors who have this sense are, kind of willing to let legislators play a part in the action. They're more likely to be consultative. I think they generally do better. But I think there are governors, who are really, believe what they read in the media, that you can't trust them. They're all a bunch of idiots. There are probably a lot of crooked idiots among legislators. They don't speak for the whole state. They're parochial. It's not the way to make public policy. And there are many, and this is a continuum, with some governors very, very understanding and very. Ned McWhirter from, Tennessee was the prototypical understanding governor. He had been Speaker of the House in Tennessee, and then he became governor. And he had friends in the legislature. He understood the legislature. He focused on a couple of issues, let the legislature handle other issues, and he had an enormous success as governor. He knew how to handle the legislature because he kind of understood the legislature in his bones. Another example of somebody who Marvin Mandel of Maryland had been Speaker of the House of Delegates, then became governor. And Marvin Mandel got what he wanted as governor, but he also knew how to make the legislature happy so that Marvin could get what he wanted. And there's the story that I believe is true, that on one occasion at least, Mandel introduced legislation knowing that it didn't have the votes, knowing that it would go down, only so that the legislature would get a victory over him. So the legislature would feel good in beating the governor on at least one occasion. And there are governors who just can't stand them. Bob Ray of Iowa, who was elected governor 3 or 4 times, referred to him as a bunch of clowns. And Iowa legislators were pretty good at the time. Still are pretty good. I mean, citizen legislators. But Ray could not deal with them, couldn't stand them. You've got, governors who just don't quite understand them but want to get along with them. Madeline Kunin, who was in the legislature in Vermont, and never really could get along with the Vermont legislature once she was governor. So it does vary, but I think the essential thing is kind of this respect for the legislature as a co-equal branch of government. And it's very easy for governors who want to get their agendas through and want to do what they believe in and have a limited time to do it. It's very easy for them to say, let's just do it. Can't take time to cultivate these people.
And you've pointed out that some of the more successful governors in dealing with the legislature, or more understanding governors in terms of what the legislature needs or wants, are former legislators themselves, but not always.
Not necessarily.
Sometimes
not necessarily.
Former legislators are very confrontational when they
deal with the legislature. It's not. It doesn't necessarily happen that way. But the one thing is that if you have people who have never been in the legislature, and let's say have been successful businessmen, and I'm thinking of Mitt Romney, and I'm thinking of the former governor of New Mexico, Gary Johnson. I mean, it may be difficult. They may not really get what this messy democratic politics is all about. And they may not think it's a very efficient way of, running the store. So I think if a person has been in the legislature and been a legislative man or woman and a leader, particularly if the person has had a leadership role where you kind of have to balance it out and you have to build consensus and you've got to keep, pay attention to get it out of the committee, and you've got to build, get the votes for some. If you've had that role, you start understanding, I think, better how a legislature works. I mean, I think Jim Florio never really was a quote-unquote legislative man, whether when he was in the New Jersey legislature or really in Congress. I think he was a policy wonk man, but never had an appreciation of the legislature, and I don't think he had that appreciation when he was governor. I think that maybe had he had that real empathy and appreciation, things would have been done a little differently on the tax thing, and he would not have steamrolled the legislature as he did.
How about Tom Kean, a former legislator who became governor in New Jersey?
Yeah, I think Kean had a sense of the legislature. I don't think Kean was, kind of an outstanding legislator, even though he became speaker. But I think he had a sense of the legislature, and I think, Kean had some ability, kind of to deal with and to appoint people who could deal with the legislature. I think Brendan Byrne didn't have the same patience, and didn't have the same empathy. He wanted things done, and he wanted them done his way, and, he may have made deals if he had to, But I don't think Brendan Byrne ever had really that kind of real regard for the legislature that Dick Hughes had. Mm-hmm. Of course, Dick Hughes had that regard for everybody. I mean, the wonderful thing about Dick Hughes, and I don't mean to be comparing Dick Hughes to Brendan Byrne as governor, but just in this kind of outreach attitude, I mean, Dick Hughes liked legislators, he liked political bosses, he liked everybody. He had this great knack of seeing what was good in people and kind of focusing on that. And that was a very strong characteristic that I think helped Hughes out politically quite a bit.
I wanted to delve a bit more into the pre-gubernatorial careers of governors in general, because I think it's an interesting point about their prior experience and how they come in to the role of governor in their relationship with the legislature. Brendan Byrne was a prosecutor, lawyer, judge, positions that give him quite a bit of authority to make decisions, act on them, get public visibility and accolades. I'm thinking currently Governor Spitzer in New York had a similar law enforcement background that built his political reputation, has dealt somewhat confrontationally with the New York legislature.
More than somewhat.
And you mentioned business executives who come into the governorship, Mitt Romney in Massachusetts.
Gary Johnson in New Mexico, yeah.
And does that lead to a bigger point that the pre-gubernatorial careers, if they lend themselves to authoritarian type decision making, tend to shape the way of the person deals with the gubernatorial powers in relation to the legislature? Or is that too much of a jump?
I think it's probably true. I think we'd have to kind of look at cases more carefully, and there certainly would be exceptions, but I think it makes sense. I mean, you know, people are shaped by their experiences. It's not, you know, strange to think that if you've been making decisions and all of that, you feel you ought to continue to make decisions, even though you're in a different seat and in a different role. That's the way that's the way you think. I mean, that's the way Mitt Romney thinks. So I don't think governors come in with a tabula rasa. I mean, they're products of their experiences and, you know, probably, you know, how their mothers raised them. But I think that experience is key experience. I think if you've got experience in the legislature as a leader, you know, having to negotiate, having to deal, having to cajole, having to beg, you look at it differently than if you've been, you know, chairman of the board or if you've been, you know, a prosecutor. I think that's quite true. And it wouldn't be a, you know, a perfect rule, but I think it would, you know, I think legislative experience is useful experience for an executive who has to deal with the legislature.
Looking at the other extreme, are there examples of governors who have become so accommodating, so willing to compromise, that their political positions and their leadership has been undermined by a sense that they are weak, that we can frankly negotiate to death and get what we want, and that they really aren't leading their following?
I'm sure there are examples. I'm trying to... I mean, Gray Davis probably was a governor who was willing to give too much, willing to pander, willing to accommodate. In California. Not perceived as having kind of much spine or spunk. Now, I'm not saying that's what brought Gray Davis down, and that isn't responsible for the recall election, but his reputation in the legislature was low before it became low on the outside. And I think it had to do with, you know, a lack of standing up for what he or she believed. He was, quote unquote, too political. I mean, Schwarzenegger is an interesting case, staying in California. I mean, Schwarzenegger is facile and flexible. And Schwarzenegger came in thinking that he could, given his persona, he could do whatever he wanted vis-a-vis the legislature. And, at first, he played a dual strategy. He dealt with them, and he took them back to his tent on the lawn of the State House, and they smoked cigars together, and he got what he could. But when he didn't get exactly what he wanted, he went to the ballot in sponsoring initiatives to put it on the ballot. And he lost disastrously because he took on not only the Democratic legislature, but he took on many of the Democratic interest groups, and he lost 4 ballot propositions. He came back from that, with a totally different way of dealing with the legislature, basically caving into the legislature, becoming, adopting the Democratic agenda in the legislature, alienating his entire legislative Republican Party. Now, I don't know how that's going to stand Schwarzenegger in the end, but right now he is ceded really major state authority to the legislature because he got his ears pinned back when he challenged them. I'm trying to think of other examples, of governors who have given too much, and I just can't offhand, but there are examples.
And of course, some states, in terms of formal powers, give the governor such limited authority, particularly in the South, in Georgia and Texas. Are pointed to, that the governor is weak institutionally and has to somehow
the governor,
deal with that.
The governor in a place like Texas, and I think Bush was an example when he was governor. The governor's got the deal. The governor's got a lieutenant governor who presides over the Senate, who's elected separately from the governor, presides over the Senate, makes appointments, and really controls the Senate. And the governor's got to deal with the Speaker of the House, who is a very powerful individual as a political leader. And in Texas, governors do. And Bush did. And it was interesting because one would have had the idea from the Bush administration in Texas that he could come in and deal with Democrats in the Congress. Now, he certainly had no record that would, even come near to his record of dealing with Democrats in the Texas legislature. On the national stage, Bush seemed to be a very different executive than he was on the state stage.
Do you have any thoughts as to why?
Well, I think partly it was the nature of his advisors. And I think partly it was the 9/11, the aftermath of 9/11, and leading to a very aggressive stand in terms of American intervention, to combat terrorism, to change regimes, to spread democracy. I think that really got Bush, kind of extended in a way that he never got extended in Texas.
Let's sort of shift the discussion back to New Jersey, and particularly to the time leading to Brendan Burns' election in 1973. It was a time, both nationally and in New Jersey, when the executive was somewhat tainted. Nationally, the Watergate scandal had obviously undermined respect for the president and the Nixon administration, leading to his impeachment, and was also at least partially a help to the Democratic campaign in 1973 when Governor Byrne was elected. In New Jersey, Governor Cahill had suffered his own problems in terms of scandals within his administration, which at least partly led to his surprising defeat in the 1973 primary, Republican primary for renomination. and the nomination of Congressman Sandman. So you have, at least in 1973, a situation where the executive, both nationally and in New Jersey, is somewhat under fire and being questioned. Any other thoughts about the context of that time? Is this just another cycle in terms of the balance between legislative and executive powers?
Well, no, I think it's an enormously important thing. You know, Watergate is a watershed event in, I think, American political history for a variety of reasons, but one of them is not the distribution of power between the governor and the legislature. I don't think Watergate, I mean, obviously it brings in new party, it gives one party, the out party, an advantage over the in party, the untainted party, an advantage over the tainted party. But I'm not sure that it really changes that balance of power. I mean, what Watergate did more than anything else is it really changed the nature of the media. And it led to a kind of investigative journalism and gotcha journalism. And what had been, you know, kind of off limits before Watergate, the private lives of politicians, the hanky-panky kind of stuff of politicians, became very much a target after Watergate. The whole ethical climate shifted, and how the media, you know, kind of dealt with issues of ethics, I think shifted after Watergate. And so that was important, but I'm not sure that legislatures were advantaged or governors were disadvantaged, at least not for very long or not in many places.
This may be a little bit off the track of our focus today, but I've read that some of the veterans of the Nixon administration, particularly Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, were shaped by the Watergate experience to say that they wanted, when they came back into power in the Bush administration, to restore the executive's position vis-a-vis the Congress and in terms of executive powers legally, constitutionally. So you don't buy into that argument?
No, I mean, I buy into the argument that Congress, you know, may have nibbled away at executive power, and that, you know, those people who kind of look at the executive as the sort of savior, the messiah, would, you know, kind of react to that nibbling away. I'm not sure
the sort of emergence of strong committees, and think of Frank Church.
That was going on. I mean, you know, Congress was Congress before Watergate. I don't think, you know, I think Watergate had a temporary impact on congressional oversight, but then, you know, that was what was going to go on. And I think Congress, you know, was going to challenge. I mean, Congress was a, you know, kind of a major institution, and it was going to challenge the executive, and had challenged the executive. And I don't care whether it was Truman or Eisenhower or Nixon or Kennedy or Johnson. Congress, you know, is a serious institution and has been a serious institution, you know, certainly since the Second World War, if not, you know, much longer. So I don't see Watergate as being responsible for an erosion of executive power or congressional encroachment on executive power. I think, you know, the Congress was, you know, the Congress was there in and off and on challenging the imperial presidency. And a lot had to do with whether the Congress was Democratic or Republican, and whether the president was Democratic or Republican. But I don't buy into the Cheney and Rumsfeld. I mean, maybe in their eyes, you know, they saw this as a product of Watergate. I I don't think so.
And I assume by your answer you also don't think that there was any trickle-down effect, that the executive on the state level was tainted by what had happened on the federal level.
No, I mean, that's too simple. I think that's too simple. No. No, I think, Nixon took it, and I don't think Nixon discredited the presidency generally, or executives generally, or even politics generally. I think Nixon took it on the chin, and it was a personal, political defeat. And I don't think, it suggested that American government was on the wrong track or corrupt. Actually, if anything, it suggested that, the political system could deal with, an infraction like this. So, this is not to say that Brendan Byrne, by being, a prosecutor didn't, that didn't help him. I mean, just as Chris Christie today might be helped to gain office. Anybody who appears to be clean, and anybody who, has stood up to crime or prosecuted politicians, at least today and for the last 20 years, will have had an advantage. I mean, I think right now people are very cynical about politics and about government and who governs them. And I think they're cynical vis-a-vis the president, they're cynical vis-a-vis governors, and they're even more cynical vis-a-vis legislative bodies.
Well, let's talk more about the political situation as Brendan Byrne makes the decision to resign as a judge and run for governor in 1973. How has New Jersey changed in terms of the constitutional structure set up in 1946 to the point in 1973 when this campaign is getting started? Has the legislature now become stronger?
The legislature is sort of getting stronger slowly, but not in any dramatic way. The legislature is evolving. It's sort of, kind of what it's trying to do basically during the 60s, and, as Byrne comes into office, it's trying to kind of improve the lot for legislators themselves. It's trying to increase the capacity of the legislature. That, I kind of looked at that, and that's really what's going on. So you find, Ray Bateman commissions the Eagleton Institute in, I think, 1963 to do a study of the legislature. And Eagleton does a study, not what I would consider to be a very good study of the legislature, but making a number of recommendations, the most important of which, from the legislature's point of view, maybe even from Eagleton's point of view, is that legislators should get a pay raise. And legislators always like to see recommendations that they should get a pay raise, because it's always a, uphill struggle.
Do you remember what they were getting paid then?
Very little. I mean, I think they came out of it all, and about the time Byrne was elected, were getting about $10,000 a year. So, I mean, you've got to account for, inflation, but still, it wasn't much. Not much, even, in constant dollars compared to the $49,500 they're getting. But, most legislatures, were paying about $10,000 a year or less. So basically, the legislature is interested in, kind of increasing its pay, improving its facilities, and mainly in staffing, in bringing on additional, primarily nonpartisan staff, but a few partisan staffers, and individual staff for members to work in their districts or to work, with their districts. And that's what's going on in the legislature. There's leadership has changed from a one-year legislature to two-year legislature. So leaders don't have to run every year. They're leaders for 2 years, and maybe even a case of somebody getting a third year in leadership. So those are the changes taking place. There are no great changes in the way the legislature does its business or its local orientation or its political concerns. It's on the way to kind of increasing its capacity.
And politically, when Brendan Byrne runs in 1973, some of his opponents in the primary and also later in general are legislators, either current or former. Talk somewhat about the sort of political strengths and weaknesses of legislators running for governor.
Well, I think for the most part, it's tough for legislators to run for governor. Legislative leaders particularly, and I'm not talking about New Jersey, I'm talking about leaders throughout the nation now. It's very difficult for legislative leaders throughout the nation to run for governor, and very few of them have been successful around the country. And the reason is that if you're a legislative leader and you have some prominence, you probably make more enemies than friends. You make the enemies are the most people you make. Ingrates are the second largest group, and friends are the way at the bottom. And you sort of get blamed for what are collective outputs of the legislature, but you don't get credit for anything the legislature does that is right, because nothing the legislature ever does is right. Because the people who want this don't get all of this, they get some of it, and the people who want that don't get all of that, they get some of it. So a legislature comes out of practically any struggle scathed, and as leaders you're identified with that. So I think, running for governor from a legislative position, even a leadership position, is, you've got more of a negative record than a positive record, at least in the public eye. And there's a lot that an opponent, can kind of charge you with, any sin of the legislature. So I think it's very difficult for former legislators.
I also wanted to go back to the point about the change in how districts are defined. And we're now in 1973. It's after the one-man, one-vote decisions, which have reshaped the geography of how state legislatures are apportioned. Discuss this and also talk more about the political impact of that in terms of, in New Jersey, for example, the relation of legislators with county chairmen, county bosses.
Well, I mean, what happened as a result of the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions and then the '66 Constitutional Convention, which rewrote the New Jersey Constitution and provided for a different districting and different process, you had this one person, one vote. So no longer did you have a state senate that was based on 21 counties, with each county having one member, whether it was a very populous county or a county with more cows than people. So after 1966 or 1967, you had your contemporary legislature of 80 assembly districts and 40 Senate districts and 80 and 40 assembly districts, each with two persons nested in the Senate districts. So you had equal populations in each district, and the districts could not, given the requirement of one person, one vote, could not respect county lines. So no longer did you have, county leaders responsible for legislator delegations as you had before redistricting and before the reapportionment decisions. This weakened county leaders. They did not have the control over their delegations because one member might be in two counties, so consequently, this strengthened the individual power of individual members, and kind of brought it out of the counties. Probably weakened the governor in that the county leaders lost power. At the same time, and probably as a result of this, you were getting individuals who were, kind of prominent in their own right as legislators. They didn't have to depend upon county delegations or county leaders. They were more a candidate-centered world that was evolving. So I think that was what was happening. And you also changed, the way the redistricting was done. It was no longer being done by the legislature as a result of the '66, constitutional change. It was now done by a redistricting commission that would, after every decennial census, meet and do it. It didn't take it out of politics, but it distanced it a little from politics, and it included on every redistricting a member of the commission who was a nonpartisan tiebreaker. So that kind of ensured, to some extent, political fairness.
Of course, by 1973, the county bosses or leaders were still very influential. We've heard in a few of the interviews during this series about the significance of the Hudson County endorsement for Governor Burns' candidacy, which was viewed as extremely important, if not critical, to his decision to get into the 1973 race. Describe how those county bosses actually exercised their power, both formally and informally.
Well, the county bosses have, their power diminished as a result of reapportionment and a different way of doing reapportionment. It diminished, but it did not vanish. Local political leaders continue to have power in important counties in New Jersey. And they have power because they can control votes, and they can control votes in primary elections. I don't mean absolute control, but I mean a lot of influence on who gets on a ballot and how elections come out. So these county leaders, there are probably 3 or 4 counties on the Republican side and 4 or 5 counties on the Democratic side where counties are still strong political units. The leaders are still influential. They're not what they used to be when Hap Farley, the Republican leader from Atlantic County, held sway in the state Senate. But they're certainly not, they have to be reckoned with. Norcross has to be reckoned with and is reckoned with.
In terms of their power over the legislature and legislators in their districts, how do they exercise that power in selection of candidates and in the day-to-day running of the legislature?
Well, I think they exercise the power in the selection of candidates and basically, kind of supporting candidates for the slate that have, done the most for the county party. People who have served, been online, played ball. I think those are the people who will get preferred.
Alan, before we broke, we had started to talk about the 1973 election in New Jersey and somewhat the politics of that. Brendan Byrne decides to resign as a sitting judge to get into the race. Some of his opponents, as I mentioned, were legislators or former legislators in the Democratic primary. At that time, what was the sort of political position of legislators as they ran for statewide office? You've mentioned a few of the weaknesses of a legislator trying to move up the ladder in a gubernatorial race. But in New Jersey, how well known were legislators in terms of their statewide recognition?
I don't think they were known at all. I think they were maybe known within their counties to a public within the county, probably not even to a large public within the county. I think they were running without anything but political bases to run on. Whereas somebody like Brendan Byrne could, kind of put together a statewide base just on the basis of, his achievements as a prosecutor. He had a persona. Legislators, I don't think, had much of a persona. They were too local.
And at that time, were there
I mean, Dick Coffey was, Mercer County chairman, he had served in the state senate. There's very little visibility there beyond Mercer County.
Mm-hmm. And I guess going back to the early 70s, and this is, I guess, in the early stages of television becoming such an important political forum, but there must have been other states, I would assume, like New York and California, where it was somewhat easier for legislators to develop a statewide political image. Yes? No?
No. I think it may have been easier, but it wasn't easy. I mean, you go... I'm just thinking, California, Jess Unruh running in 1970. Unruh ran against Ronald Reagan. Reagan was the governor of California and was running for re-election, and Jess Unruh, who was the Speaker of the Assembly, challenged him. Now, Unruh had some statewide recognition, but he didn't have a lot of money, and he had to try to, get free media attention, free television attention by doing sort of outrageous things. Unruh, was probably one leader who had a statewide persona, because he was known as Big Daddy. He had a negative persona, but he had a statewide persona associated with locking the Republicans in the Assembly chamber until they finally voted on the bill that he wanted voted on. I think legislators didn't bring a lot to a statewide race, nor do they today.
And in New Jersey, you also have the tradition at that time that the legislative leaders would rotate. To talk about that and the political impact of the rotation.
I think you had a tradition there of a weak legislature passing around power, with county leaders exercising a good deal of the power. And nobody could get much power within the legislature if you've got rotating leadership. I mean, the thing that gives leaders power is not so much the present situation where they can or can't exercise it. What gives leaders power over members are the expectations that members have that these leaders will be around for a while. You never know what you need from a legislative leader in the future, so you don't want to cross him or her in the present. So power is very much associated with the prospect of being around. And when there was a rotating system, you just know these people aren't going to be around, and you'll be, in the legislature as long as they are, and they'll be back, and they'll either be out or in the other house or in the back benches. It's when New Jersey breaks that tradition, and you've got leaders who are serving, 4 years or 6 years or even more, that you have the beginnings of kind of some power in the hands of legislative leadership. Not enough, to countervail the power of a governor, but it's getting substantial now. So you look at the leadership today, Cody and Roberts, they've got power. They can't do what they want. They need their caucuses with them, particularly Cody in the Senate, but they can put something together.
To the extent that you know, and you may not, when did the rotation system start, and was it simply that people wanted their own bite at the apple at some point? Yeah,
I don't know the answer as to, it had been in effect. It was, when I came on the scene in '66, that was the system. It was a tradition. It was what people did, and I think it was to pass it around. Everybody wants a bite at the apple. I don't even know that they had to make an argument for it. Obviously, from the point of every member other than the leader himself or herself, it's better to have rotation. You're more likely to get it. Mm-hmm. So there's a constituency, for the only constituency for not having rotation is the incumbent leader if he or she can hang on. The constituency for rotation is all the others who, want to get a chance to be leader. The other thing, let me mention here that increased the power of leaders, or the legislature, and this is really very significant, what increased the power of legislatures vis-a-vis the governor. In addition, to the staffing capacity that they built up, and that, started to get built up before Byrne, and it continued, and it really got built up when Kane was governor and Alan Karcher was the Speaker of the Assembly. The Democrats controlled the legislature, Kane was the governor, and the Democrats started to build up, Karcher particularly, partisan staffing. And you had an enormous increase in partisan staffing to go along with what had been a previous increase in the staffing of the nonpartisan wing, the Office of Legislative Services. So you've got this increase in staff, and including fiscal staff, giving the legislature a capability, to get advice, to get information, to kind of do analytical work, giving them that capability which they hadn't really had, but developed, from the 60s, late 60s on. But more important, I think, what happened in New Jersey and in many states is the legislature, the legislative parties, led by legislative party leaders, took responsibility for campaigns. What had once been a system where campaigns, legislative campaigns, were run outside of the legislature by county parties, county party leaders, or individual candidates, now became a system where the legislative party leaders took responsibility for getting their members reelected and challenging, targeting members in the other party, winning control or keeping control. Prior to this, the governor played a big role in raising funds for legislative party, for his party members in the legislature. You had to go to the governor to get money, or to the county leader, but the governor the governor controlled the state party, if you had a governor of that particular party. When the legislature kind of took it over, as happened first in California and then in Illinois and in many states now, you've got legislative parties doing this. Then the legislature didn't have to go to the governor hat in hand for money. The legislature through its party leaders raised their own funds, and that gave them a degree of independence from the governor that they hadn't had. So that gave them a little leg up in the struggle with the executive branch.
And part of that, I guess, also is running, at least in some states and in some elections, not uniformly, perhaps with a statewide theme, where previously it had been pretty much a bottom-up type campaign.
Yeah, all campaigns count at the local level. All politics is local, all politics is personal. Still, what the legislative party leaders in New Jersey and other states have done is they've participated in recruiting candidates. So they recruit candidates that they think can win. They don't just leave it to the bottom-up strategy of coming up from districts or counties. Secondly, they raised money and allocated money. And they allocated money in a much more effective way than it had been allocated before. Prior to the legislative party leaders raising money, individual candidates would raise money. And the safe legislators who didn't need the money probably could raise the most because they were the safest and people wanted to be on the right side of people who were going to be returned to office. What legislative party leaders did was that it's sort of a Robin Hood. They took from the people who could raise it, or they took from the contributors to the people who could raise it, and they pooled it and they gave it to the people who needed it. Sort of a communistic system, to each according to his needs or her needs. So those candidates who could win, who were in targeted districts, whether challengers or incumbents, got the money, not the safe legislators, So the money was used much more effectively. So the fundraising and fund allocation was a big part. They also provided centralized services such as polling, strategic advice, consultants. So you had, obviously the campaigns were played out at the local level and had local ramifications and local permutations. But you did have themes. You did have themes, and you had the leaders involved. And I think this is the other thing about legislative campaigns today is because they're run by the legislative leaders and legislative parties, they become part of the legislative process. They're not outside and the legislature's here. You don't have campaigning here and governing there. They both come together. So the legislative session and how the two parties position themselves as minority and majority, the issues they bring up, the way they target members, the majority targets minority members in the legislature, is all part of the campaign. So that is very different than it used to be.
Well, if we go back again to 1973, and 1973 predates much of what we've just been discussing.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
But there was still somewhat of a theme for different reasons. As we pointed out, Watergate was fresh in voters' minds. In New Jersey, the problems that had affected Governor Cahill's administrations had left a similar impression, I guess, that government needed cleaning up, that there was a mood for reform, which largely led to Governor Burns' recruitment as a candidate by the Democratic leaders, thinking that as a former prosecutor and judge, he was the right type in terms of career for the time. So you did have sort of this theme, indirectly, the corruption of cleaning up government, of reforming government. To some extent it was tied to money and campaign finance and so forth, which led to his election very easily over Congressman Sandman, who had surprisingly defeated Governor Cahill. Once a governor gets elected, let's talk about the chronology a little bit. Even before he gets inaugurated, there are things that he has to deal with in terms of the legislature that really come to his plate very quickly after the election. One of them would be who are the leaders that he's going to have to deal with after his inauguration. Talk about that process and how much a governor has input into the selection of leaders. And perhaps we should pin it down, at least to start with Governor Burns' situation. He's been elected governor in a landslide election as the head of the Democrats. The Democrats have taken strong control of the New Jersey legislature. And I assume his candidacy got a lot of credit for that in terms of the legislative success that the Democrats achieved in the 1973 election. That gives him quite a bit of leverage, doesn't it, in terms of how the legislature is organized and led?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't think it necessarily does. I think the legislature, basically wants to do its own thing. And the struggle for leadership in the New Jersey legislature at that time is, and probably to some extent today, is a struggle between regions and individuals. North versus south, this county versus that county. And, in that day, you would be sure, if a major, Democratic county had the presidency of the Senate, some other Democratic county would have the Speaker of the Assembly. So I think it was much more a give and take within the legislature and within that. Now, if a governor wanted to affect the outcome, I think the governor could do it. It would be, largely behind the scenes. And to my knowledge, I don't know, and you probably would know more about this, I don't think Byrne did intervene. And I don't know, and I doubt that, Brendan Byrne was used by candidates internally and for them to, push their cases. I don't know. The only, clear intervention that I can think of recently has been Jim McGreevey, who did intervene and intervened, to get rid of Joe Doria from becoming Speaker. There was a big fight between North Jersey and South Jersey, and, maybe somebody felt they had to intervene. In this case, it was McGreevey, I think, to get peace rather than anything else. But in very few states are there examples of governors, intervening in any way that could become public. The only state I can think of is where the governor really controls who legislative leaders are, and even down to committee chairman, is Louisiana. That's been traditional at least since the days of Huey Long. But I think it's been, kind of very, I don't think the legislative leadership, relates to who is governor to any great extent in New Jersey. I'm not saying that the governor won't be affected by who the legislative leaders are, but I think the governor generally deals with with whatever hand he is dealt by the legislature as far as leadership.
I assume there's also some natural tension between legislators who have been around for a while, doing their thing, learning the issues, developing programs, which comes to the front when some new governor comes in, particularly one who has not been around dealing with the issues and the people in Trenton or another state capital. And there must be some feeling among the veteran legislators, these guys don't know what they're doing and they're going to screw things up.
I think this is almost a law of, political nature, and it goes beyond New Jersey and to most places. The new governor comes in very often saying, these people don't know what they're doing. And the experienced people in the legislature see a new governor coming, particularly an outsider, outside the normal politics, and say, well, this guy just doesn't know how it's done down here. He's going to fall flat on his face. And I think that's sort of a normal kind of tendency. Now, a governor from outside can get over a little bit of that by appointing people as his chief of staff or legislative counsel or whatever, people who have reputations as insiders and experience at the inside game. I mean, a Harold Hodes, working for Brendan Byrne would be, somebody that the legislators credited with, having political skill and political smarts. So I think a governor can get over that with the right appointments. Take, the current governor, Corzine. Corzine certainly was an outsider, looked like an outsider, talked like an outsider, walked like an outsider, but didn't appoint any, kind of real graybeards from inside to give him advice. So I think that, kind of lowers the governor's, standing in the eyes of insiders. How much that means, I don't know. It's stylistic, when push comes to shove, if the governor's popular and if the governor's got a program that they can, back without, risking their seats, they'll go along.
Of course, another.
I mean, they didn't like Christie Whitman a lot. I mean, they were, she wasn't comfortable with them, and I'm talking about the Republicans now, and they weren't comfortable with her. But she didn't do bad with them. They went along with her. They did, generally, well by her programs.
When
it's reducing taxes, it's easy to go along.
Yeah. Well, when you say comfortable, and we'll talk more about this in terms of Brendan Byrne's personality and style, what did you mean that the legislators weren't comfortable with Governor Whitman?
She wasn't one of the boys. And I don't mean that as it's not gender related. You can be one of the boys and not be female. She didn't meet with them. She didn't really, kind of have small talk for them. She wasn't. I think if she had been comfortable with them, they would have been more comfortable with her. Given her background, given her patrician status. Now, Tom Kane had the same background and a worse accent than Christine Whitman, but he could get along with them. So the comfort level, works both ways. If you feel comfortable with them, they're more likely to feel comfortable with you. Again, I don't know that this relates to a bottom line. It's sort of stylistic politics, and it also indicates, whether they, they think well of you or not. It's better if the governor has a good reputation among legislators, a good professional reputation. I think it does the governor better.
You mentioned that some governors bring in with them staff that are either former legislators or familiar in terms of the politics of the state capitol and so forth. Brendan Byrne brought in a mix of people, most of them, at least in the governor's office, who in his first year in office were somewhat fresh. Luke Hayden was the governor's special counsel. Dick Leone, who was his campaign manager, had worked in the Hughes administration but had never served in the legislature. So I guess you would sort of type him then as bringing in more outsiders than in insiders.
Absolutely. He brought in outsiders who were smart but not savvy in the ways of the insider politicians.
And one criticism that we've heard in these interviews is that there was an image that these people were so smart that they were somewhat aloof and arrogant and didn't talk talk of the legislature.
It's easy to take that attitude because it's very easy to condescend to legislators, but legislators don't necessarily like that. But it's easy because they're not, they haven't all gone to Princeton. Some of them went to Rutgers or Seton Hall. And they're not all, kind of book smart. They're street smart. The dumbest legislator is, pretty street smart, or he or she wouldn't be there. So, they don't always get where they're going by walking a direct line. It's a legislature is a circuitous place, and I think people who want to get an agenda through and have been trained, in public policy and who are analytically very, bright, might not be good at that, good at relating to that. I mean, Harold Hodis is good at that. That's the way Harold Hodis's mind works in circles.
When Brendan Byrne is elected, he's elected with substantial majorities of Democrats in each of the two houses. Democrats take seats that politically they hadn't taken in many years. They were essentially Republican districts, helped not only by his candidacy, but the anti-Republican moved as a reaction to Watergate. Talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of having such strong majorities in the legislature with the governor of the same party.
Well, I think it's always advantageous to have a majority, and the more the merrier. Now, having said that, the conventional wisdom is that if you've got a narrow majority, you get everybody on board. They got to be on board, because you can't, nobody can not be on board in that majority, for the majority to hold. When you've got a larger majority, people can get off the reservation. I think a large majority is useful as long as you recognize that you're not going to keep that majority necessarily, that after the next election that may be whittled down. And you just got to, if you're a leader, you've just got to recognize that some members of that majority are not going to be able to give you the votes that you might want because they come from marginal districts, or if they're Democrats, they come from Republican districts. They want to get reelected, and even though they might not get reelected, they're damn well going to try to get reelected. I don't know. I think the observation that you want a very narrow majority is kind of a theoretical observation. I think you want as many, and then you just sort of maneuver, as you can maneuver, letting off people whenever you can from votes that are going to hurt them.
And of course, one of the votes that many in the legislature, as the Byrne administration takes office, fear is the major issue of state taxes. Governor Byrne changes his position in the campaign. He had said he didn't see the need for an income tax in the, quote, foreseeable future, but shortly after taking office changes his mind and says the foreseeable future is now. The problem that I guess deals or poses to new legislators is that it gives them, a political decision that they don't really want to have to deal with, particularly in those districts that were marginal. But talk a bit about the sort of history of taxes in the New Jersey legislature and how any governor has to deal with that. There were other governors in the past who tried and failed to deal with statewide finances.
Dick Hughes, tried to get an income tax and came very close to getting an income tax, couldn't get it, was let down by, I think it was Essex County that he thought he had with him and didn't have with him. And he wound up, coming off it with a sales tax. So, I mean, that was the first, as I recollect, the first broad-based tax in New Jersey. Getting that first broad-based tax, took many years. It really is interesting because, we go back to the 60s where taxes were such a salient issue. And they're no less salient today. Whether it's taxes or tolls or whatever, people, I think, have been very consistent throughout New Jersey history, throughout United States history. They don't want to pay higher taxes. And I think any politician, governors and legislators that, manage to increase taxes are certainly more at risk than if they didn't. And it's really remarkable that they've been able to, increase taxes as they have, and kind of get away with it without tremendous political reprisal. Although, in New Jersey's history, there has been, Jim Florio and the Democratic legislature paid dearly for the income sales tax increase. So this is, I guess, when you look at state politics, and I think this would be true just about of any state, that increasing taxes is what any politician really fears.
But in New Jersey, as you mentioned before, legislators are somewhat more attuned toward local concerns and local issues, which I assume argues against any financing system that goes to the state level, to financing statewide concerns rather than to local government or county or municipal
I think
programs.
I think they're local. I think they recognize responsibilities to the state. They recognize the need for broad-based taxes. I think politically it's just a very difficult thing to make, whether they were parochial or less parochial. The fact is that can cost them politically. And New Jersey legislators, like legislators all over the country, are very attuned to the politics of their district, and they don't want to have spent their careers in local office and running for the legislature and serving in the legislature to get defeated because they cast a vote for taxes, for higher taxes. I mean, they're very tax averse. So whenever they do it, it's a sort of a remarkable demonstration, in my opinion. It may be the quote-unquote right thing to do, but it's certainly not the quote-unquote popular thing to do.
But isn't
unless you're just running from Princeton borough and township, in which case they probably could raise taxes. Maybe not, but they probably could.
But isn't part of it their practical political recognition that New Jersey voters, probably in contrast to most other states, don't see the value of statewide programs or state government to the same extent as voters in other states?
I don't think that's true anymore. It might have been true 20 or 30 years ago. I think New Jersey people are probably a little more localistically oriented, in their little municipalities and townships and what have you. But I think politicians everywhere, we now have a good share of, funds comes from the state. Maybe not as much as in Hawaii, but a good share of funds for the localities comes from the state. Legislators recognize that the state is raising the money and dispensing money in local aid. And I think, citizens just don't like the idea of paying more. I mean, it's very easy. We want better services, and we can get them for lower taxes if you just get rid of waste and corruption. I mean, that is the reasoning, I think, that most of us go through, and we think taxes should go down, services should go up, and that's the way of the world.
Now, going back to those early days of the Byrne administration and the decision to propose a state income tax, any memories of that period? He fails in his first attempts, despite the substantial Democratic control in both houses. Any anecdotes or thoughts?
No, I don't
that?
have any anecdotes or thoughts, but just sort of looking back on it, it's quite impressive. I guess...
That he failed or succeeded?
No, that he succeeded. Understandable that he failed, and impressive that he succeeded. Now, he had the right circumstances, which he didn't completely engineer, but with the courts closing the schools and all of that, so everything fell into a line. But you've got to give the governor credit for really taking on a difficult issue and persevering and coming out of it ahead. I would compare John Corzine in kind of taking on debt restructuring as a tough issue. Not a political winner, but something that the governor thinks has got to be done. And we'll see where Corzine comes out, but it's certainly at great political risk to him, and it'll be a risky issue for people in the legislature. I mean, the Republicans are unanimous against it, so it's only the Democrats going into the tank together. Sometimes when you can get the agreement of the minority party and you can get both parties to go into the tank together for something that could be unpopular, like an increase in the income tax or sales tax or some other kind of legislation, sometimes that's protection, where everybody's in the tank together. But here it's only Democrats who are going to be in any tanks there are. So I would say that, even though Byrne, when he is remembered for public policy, is generally remembered for the Pine Lands, maybe remembered for casino gambling, I think really his major contribution was that income tax. Really, that was the toughest thing.
Well, you mentioned the Supreme Court's role in the eventual leverage and passage of the income tax in New Jersey. Are there examples in other states where, and in New Jersey there was much, at least public criticism by the Republicans of the intervention of the court in the policy process, these mandates, and the highly unusual order that the court issued in closing the schools.
This was, I mean, New Jersey has had, less so now than certainly over the years, a very strong interventionist court, court that really did believe that they had a major role in governance.
Now, there are other examples in other states where the courts, particularly in education, intervened in the process.
Yeah. I mean, the court, I mean, I think New Jersey may have a particularly activist court tradition, but there are all sorts of other states where the courts have gone much further than legislators, you know, would have wanted them to go. I mean, I can think of Ohio, where the legislature's been almost in a running battle with the court, and you know, other states, and you know, the court was an issue in California. Yeah, and particularly in the field of education finance, that's where the courts have, you know, basically had a great impact, more than in any other field. But the courts have been, you know, substantial players in public policy, and we know less about, or I know less about, I should say, you know, the court and the legislature than I know about the governor and the legislature, but the courts have been there.
Are there examples in other states where the courts have been constrained by the legislature in terms of them trying to either circumscribe their constitutional authority or their powers in other areas? I guess I remember most recently in Pennsylvania, the controversy over the judicial pay raises.
Yeah, pay raises are the major way that legislatures get back at courts, or signal the courts, hey, pull back. I mean, it's not explicit, but you know, courts know what's going on. But it's usually through pay raises.
Have there been any successful efforts in other states where legislatures have tried to suggest referendums to limit the court's constitutional authority?
Yeah, I think that's been less. I don't know, but I think that's been less of a case. Very often, you know, Supreme Court justices are elected, so a lot of that is played out through, you know, through the election process and through, you know, campaigns in which, you know, legislators or Republicans are on one side or Democrats on the other or whatever is going on. So a lot of, you know, courts are affected by these campaigns. I think that in education policy, courts have stood their ground, generally speaking, you know, and been involved interpreting the constitutions along with, you know, what they thought was right. Hey, I'm going to have to go. I'm getting...
Let's just tie this up. Going back to the tax issue, when the tax is finally passed, and we've discussed this in other interviews, the legislature takes the lead in New Jersey rather than the governor. The governor has tried and failed in a couple of his attempts to pass the income tax. His public poll ratings have sharply declined. His popularity has fallen. And I have been asking people, was this a conscious strategy that the governor's political clout was so weak that the legislature had to sort of look like they were taking the lead, and whether this was a conscious strategy with the executive and the legislature to do this, or was it really more the legislature initiating it? I guess most of the responses have been that the legislature did it on its own. Do you recall anything about explaining how the legislature pushed through the final income tax?
No, but I would agree that the legislature probably did do it on its own. I mean, it might not have done it had Byrne not been out there. trying to get it done. But then when it had to get done, they put it together. There were a number of members of the legislature, like Al Burstein, and who believed in this. So there was, kind of there was inside leadership inside the legislature. So I think it could have been done that way.